If anyone was wondering about the coincidence of the last names, I'll just sort of put that out there. Who, as all of you know, is an acclaimed Los Angeles Times columnist. So thank you all for being here. Let me just say a little bit so we can have discussion. I really want to have an exchange with you all about what I was trying to do. And again, I cannot overstate my appreciation for the feedback, because one of my great disappointments, or at least I'm hoping, right? The book has actually generated a lot of heat and a lot of controversy, and we've had a lot of coverage, but the depth of the coverage has not quite been what I would have hoped, because when you only get 4 minutes on some show, right? It's hard to communicate a lot. But so this is a chance, I think, to go a lot deeper and to engage with a lot of the issues. So what I wanted to do in this book, so I teach family law, race and the law, other courses related to race and gender and equality. And what I wanted to do in the book was to fill a hole, really to enrich and extend those conversations that Melissa referred to that we've been having since college and that are probably occurring in some dorm room right now about relations among African Americans. As I taught family law year after year and discussed the changing American family, I became very distressed to see that while there was a lot about marriage in general and how marriage was changing, and while there was a lot about the black poor and the waning of marriage among the black poor, there was actually very little about the black middle class. And when we did talk about the black middle class and marriage, it was mostly in popular media, newspaper, magazine articles, television specials, which, again, one might describe as superficial or sensationalist, full of heat but not much light. And I think I, along with many other people, became tired of that level of discussion, became tired of hearing sort of the same sort of tropes over and over and over again. So I wanted to try to write the book to bring some information, some analysis, some research to bear on what I think is one of the most fundamental developments, yet at least discussed developments, of the second half of the 20th century, which is the decline in marriage among African Americans. I started writing the book as a research study, where I was kind of weaving together research not only from law, but from history, from psychology, from sociology, from economics. And then almost by chance, I began to interview people. And when I began to interview people, because these were middle class or upper middle class black women who felt that their lives actually weren't reflected, not only in the scholarship, but also in the popular media discourse. And I began to interview them, and those interviews really shaped the book. And they shaped the book in a couple of ways that are relevant to our discussion today. One, the book is, it started off, in fact, much more as a critique of marriage as a legal institution. Because that's the way I teach family law, right? The first question on the first day of family law is, if we didn't have marriage as a legal institution, would we need to create it, right? In other words, should we abolish it? Should we just get rid of it, right? What would be gained, what would be lost? And we spend 3 weeks on that question. And so that's sort of the issue that I actually started with. But once I began to talk to people, I realized that they were much less critical of marriage than I was in my role as an academic. And that, in fact, what many of the women that I interviewed wanted, well, it wasn't marriage per se. It was really a stable, secure relationship. It was really a partner to raise children with. 70% of black children are born to unmarried parents. Black women are more likely than any other group of women to raise children alone. And it's not, for the most part, because they start out thinking, boy, it would really be cool to raise that child alone. That's actually not what's happening. So the book became much less normative than law professors typically are. That is, it wasn't that I had a position on marriage. I really did begin to see myself as someone who was trying to figure out how people were viewing their lives, how they were perceiving their world, how they were making decisions, to try to understand how they navigated and what they wanted. And what they wanted, black women no less than other women, no less than other people in American society, was basically a partnership. And the unfortunate reality is that African Americans have fewer partnerships. We can put marriage aside. Fewer enduring, committed relationships among African Americans than among other groups. Right? So marriage is not the issue. It's just kind of a marker of a decline of intimate, committed relationships. So I wanted to try to explain the broad cultural and economic forces that have caused relationships to decline among African Americans. And as I began to do so, it also became apparent that there was a great deal of continuity between the experience of African Americans and the experience of other Americans. When we look at most of the research, and this became more and more troubling over time, most of the research and the writings and the books about marriage and relationships don't talk much about black people. They just don't. They talk a little bit on page 185 just to show that there's some attention given there. And then most of the stuff about black people, which focuses on poor people, talks about African Americans as though their experience is somehow wholly distinct or dissimilar from that of the mainstream in society. So the overarching objective, kind of an assumption, that's kind of the framework for the book, is to connect the particular experience of African Americans to the universal experiences in American society. We see continuity there as well as differences. And this is true in a number of ways. I mean, the most obvious way is in the increase in single-parent families. It's also true with respect to working parents. It's also true with respect to women who earn more than their husbands. It's also true with respect to the marriage decline, right? White women as well are more likely to be unmarried now than they were 30 or 40 years ago. So my goal was to try to enrich our conversations about this changing terrain of intimacy. And the core problem, and I'll just take a few minutes, the core problem is this, that black women have moved ahead. While black women have moved ahead, which is a good thing, it is a good thing, black men have fallen behind. 1 in 10 black men as we speak now are in prison. These are men in their 20s or early 30s. 1 in 4 will go to prison. At the other extreme, nearly twice as many black women as black men graduate college. And as a father of 3 sons, that's a statistic that weighs heavily on me. Twice as many black women as black men graduate from college. Nearly twice as many every year. And that raises a whole host of issues. And it does raise, of course, lots of structural questions about what to do. What should government policy do? How do we get out of this mess? And this book, admittedly, does not address those issues. That's just not the focus of the book, right? It's not a book about government policy. That's actually my next book, which is sort of the prequel to this one, right? And the prequel is, how do we get into this mess and how do we get out? What does the government have to do? So that the gap that is emerging between black boys and everyone else can be closed. And that's a huge challenge for our nation, which at the moment we give very, very little time to. So that's the next book. This book is the book that we might say is the in the meantime book, which is what do black women do in the meantime? Because truth be told, even if by some miracle we had a political commitment, when this is not happening, but if we had a political commitment to address the problems with young black boys, we still have a generation or more that's been lost. That's the reality. We could not, even if we all wanted to, address the structural problems that afflict young black men within the next 10 or 20 years. That's the magnitude of the problem. We are not changing and could not change the trajectories of those young men who are already born, who are 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old. At best, we're going to change things for those who are infants now and those yet to be born. So that raises a question for black women of what to do. And one way to put it is the way that I guess I put it, maybe unfortunately, maybe not, certainly provocatively to a Newsweek reporter who then used that as a quote. She said, Banks raises the question of whether black women should continue to be held hostage to the disadvantages and deficiencies of black men. And that actually is the question. Should black women continue to be held hostage to the deficiencies and the disadvantages suffered by black men? What we do now in response to this gender gap is that we encourage, through all sorts of ways, we encourage black women to remain with black women, to partner with black men. We try to convince them as a society through popular media, through scholarship, through all manner. We try to convince black women that they can only partner with the black man and that they should only partner with the black man. That it's a good thing to stay within the race, a bad thing to go outside of it, and that they don't have an option anyway. That's the message that black women have received. That's an ethos or an ideology that many have enacted. And the central message of the book, I actually don't say, I try, again, I don't give advice. It's not an advice book. I actually don't say that black women should marry out. I don't think that sentence is actually ever in the book. I don't give that advice because I'm not a marriage counselor. But what I do say, in terms of analysis, is that the stand by the black man approach actually hasn't worked well. And the evidence that it hasn't worked well is that African Americans, not only African Americans have fewer relationships, as many as 70% of black women are unmarried, 70% of black children are born to unmarried parents. The marriage gap spans the socioeconomic spectrum. We see it among the poor. We also see it among the middle class. College-educated black women are twice as likely as college-educated white women to be unmarried. Black men as well are more likely to be unmarried than white men. This is true along the socioeconomic spectrum. So we have the approach, the stand by the black man approach actually hasn't worked. It hasn't created the strong black family that people want. It has left more black women single, unmarried, and not because they don't want to be married than ever before. And it's contributed to higher divorce rates among African Americans than among any other group. 50% of black couples divorce within the first 10 years of marriage. This is at a time when divorce rates have declined overall since the late 70s or early 80s. This is at a time when a third or less of white couples were divorced during that same period. A reasonable estimate is that 2 out of every 3 black couples will divorce. 2 out of every 3. And this is not a, this is a bad situation. It's bad for the couples, it's bad for the children, it's not promoting racial equality in any form. One problem, so I do want to emphasize, and this is just hit a few high points, I do want to emphasize that I think more intermarriage for black women would be a good thing. I mean, currently it's stigmatized. Black women are the least likely of any group. Well, here's the core, here's the core strand of the book. Black women have the fewest partners within their own group because black men are in prison, because they're unemployed, because they're not going to college. They have the fewest partners within their own group. And that leads to a whole host of problems. Yet they are also the least likely to marry across racial lines. Black men are 2 to 3 times as likely as black women to marry across racial lines. Asian Americans and Latinos are 3 or more times as likely as black women to marry across racial lines. Even whites, which is the largest group and you would expect to have lower intermarriage rates, there's evidence now that they're in competition with black women to see who can have the lowest intermarriage rates. All right, so black women are the most segregated group in society in terms of their intimate relationships. And a large part of why is because of the pressures that we all put on them to try to bolster the black family, lift up the black man. And these are noble sentiments, noble goals, but that strategy has not worked. And in fact, it would be a better strategy if we gave more black women the permission and the freedom to make the choices that are best for them and to marry a partner or find a partner who they are compatible with, irrespective of that person's race. If we did that, more black women would cross racial lines, and that would be a desirable thing. They would have more relationships. They'd, in fact, have better relationships. One of the little known facts, I put a lot of statistics in the book, and a lot of them were very hard to confront, frankly. But one of them is that there's actually evidence that black women who marry non-black men have substantially lower divorce rates than black women who marry black men. That's a doozy, isn't it? Black women who marry non-black men have substantially lower divorce rates than black women who marry black men. Now, this is not to say black women should not marry black men, but it is to say that our emphasis on encouraging black women to marry within the race, even as the pool of black men is distressingly limited, has had some unanticipated consequences. Another benefit of black women marrying outside the race, and this is the sort of paradox of the book, is that if black women expand their options, they would help to counter or diminish the power imbalance between black men and women that is also part of the marriage decline. Right? One reason even affluent African Americans are less likely to marry than whites is because the numbers imbalance gives black men disproportionate power in relationships. Black men are scarce, black women are plentiful. When you're scarce in a relationship, you find power in lack of numbers because you have more options outside the relationship than your partner does. Black men probably respond in the same way that men of any group would to this sort of power. They become less likely to marry, more likely to want non-marital relationships. Sometimes those might be relationships with more than one person at a time. And that's the power imbalance that is not a result of bad choices that women make. It's not a result of the women choosing the wrong guy. It's actually a result of this broad cultural and economic forces that have created this market which systematically operates to the disadvantage of black women, even those black women who would seem to have it all made in other aspects of their life. And so one way for black women to counteract this power imbalance, in fact the only way for black women to counteract this power imbalance, is to expand their own options. As black women expand their own options, and then in fact the relationships among African American couples would improve. It actually would improve. And this is not to say this is a solution. It is to say that it would be a good thing, especially for middle-class African Americans, if black women opened up themselves to a broader array of options and thereby elicited better behavior and better treatment from the black men in their lives. So I think I'll stop there. That should get much of it. I mean, we can just discuss more.
That's the moderator. I want to thank you for having me here, Tim.